looking at is the economics of food security policies in a number of different countries in the Middle East and North Africa. And in particular, I'm doing case studies on both Lebanon and Jordan, but I want to talk today mainly about Lebanon. Firstly, because we're in Lebanon, and secondly, because I haven't started the Jordan work yet. But I'm looking at food security very much from a macro aggregate point of view. In other words, how does a country get enough food to feed its population? Which is not the same thing as individual or household food security, because a country may have aggregate food supplies, but if they're not accessible and available, there may still be individual level food insecurity. But I'm looking at things very much from the macro level, which is necessary but not sufficient to ensure that all families and households have adequate food. And what I want to look at is, in particular, the relative role of imports and domestic production at the macro level in meeting countries' food supplies. Secondly, to look at the impact of the massive hike in global food prices that took place in 2007-2008, and again recurred in the early parts of this year, to look at the impact of that's had on Lebanon from a macro point of view. Thirdly, to look at the extent to which that global food price crisis of 2007-2008 has caused a change in the country's approach to its food security strategy. And lastly, to look at the economic implications of a food security strategy that focuses more on domestic production as the route to food security, rather than a trade-based strategy which relies much more heavily on importation of food. Lebanon is extremely heavily dependent on imported food to meet a large part of its domestic requirements, and that's illustrated by the fact that in the mid-2000s, Lebanon was in the top 20 countries in the world in terms of per capita food imports, so a very heavy dependence on food imports. Come to the conclusion that Lebanon does face issues of achieving food security. But generally, in most years, around 90% of Lebanon's consumption of cereals is met through imports. I mean, what you can see in that graph is that between about the mid to late 1990s through to the late 2000s, Lebanon's domestic production of wheat has almost trebled, from around 60,000 metric tons to around 120,000 metric tons. So a very dramatic increase in domestic wheat production. And what I thought I'd do is try and look at some of the macroeconomic implications of these dramatic price rises on the Lebanese economy. Well, firstly, there was a very dramatic increase in the cost of food and agricultural imports into Lebanon. This is the import unit value index, and you can see, looking at 2007-2008, the index value of agricultural inputs increased by almost 50%. So a huge increase in the cost of agricultural and food imports into Lebanon as a result of the global price hikes of 2007-2008. Previously, the Ministry of Agriculture's budget barely covered staff costs, but it's been trebled now to nearly 1% of government expenditure. There is meant to be 400 new posts created in the Ministry of Agriculture, which was previously suffering from a severe lack of personnel. There have also been announcements or have been measures to try and come up with a more strategic plan. The Ministry of Agriculture has proposed a strategic plan jointly with the Ministry of Economy and Trade, which apparently, I'm told, has already been passed by Cabinet. And within this strategy, there is a desire to actually increase the local production of cereals rather than relying so heavily on imports, particularly the local production of wheat and barley. And in that statement, it was suggested that Lebanon should move from producing only around 15 to 20% of its cereal requirements, relying on imports for the remainder, to producing 30 to 40% of its domestic requirements of cereal. In other words, trade data suggests that Lebanon has a revealed comparative advantage in exporting goods like fruit and vegetables from the export sector, from the agricultural sector, and using the foreign exchange that it generates in that way to import the products that it doesn't have a revealed comparative advantage, i.e. in wheat, which is in fact exactly the opposite of the current strategy that seems to be on the table for the agricultural sector. Increasingly, countries in MENA have actually started to adopt a new concept, which is not food security, but food sovereignty. And this concept of food sovereignty encompasses not just the economic dimension, but also very important political dimensions, and argues very strongly that we can't look at macroeconomic food security strategies from a purely economic perspective, which is what I've done here. You have to encompass or incorporate the political objectives as well. Both domestic politics, what does a sudden, unpredicted global price hike mean in terms of domestic politics if it results in a sudden increase in food costs when about 20 to 30% of take-home income in your country is spent on food? So, although I'm an economist, I'm very much a political economist, and I think even though organisations like the World Bank, the FAO, IFPRI right now are suggesting policy advice to the MENA region as a whole, that they should rely heavily on a trade-based food security strategy, I think that policy advice often ignores very important political dimensions of food security, or the more recent concept of food sovereignty. Okay, thank you very much.